General Hospital spoilers tease that Scout Kane is about to take bold, irreversible steps that will shift the balance of power and fracture relationships already cracked by betrayal and grief. The soft-spoken girl who once clung to childhood ideals is gone. In her place stands someone shaped by absence, hurt, and the slow unraveling of everything she once believed about her father. This is not just a story of a daughter betrayed, but of a daughter rising from the wreckage of trust, a storm born from the ashes of love that turned cold. It began after the loss of Sam McCall, Scout's mother, a loss that changed everything. The pain of losing a parent is always heavy, but for Scout, Sam had been her rock, the gentle voice in the dark, the one person who had never turned her away. Sam's death came suddenly, a cruel twist of fate that left Scout clinging to the one instruction her mother left behind: live with your father. It was her dying wish, a final expression of faith in Drew Kane's capacity to protect and love his daughter. And for a while, Drew honored that wish. He had been broken by Sam's death, yes, but not unrecognizable. In those early days, grief made him softer, quieter, and more attentive to Scout's needs. There were shared meals, evenings spent watching old movies Sam had loved, and long walks where silence filled the space where their pain met. He held her when she cried. He kissed her forehead at night. He told her he loved her. For a fleeting time, Scout believed that even in the absence of her mother, she could still belong somewhere. But Drew changed. The transformation wasn't sudden. It came like fog, slow and creeping, until Scout could no longer see the man who once held her hand. Drew became obsessed, not with her, not with healing, but with vengeance. Something inside him had snapped. He buried himself in business dealings and vendettas, tracking the people he blamed for Sam's death, for his own suffering. Each day he returned home later. Each morning he left earlier. Scout's voice began to disappear in the silence of the house. Her school awards went unnoticed. Her birthdays were marked by texts instead of hugs. Eventually, there were no words at all. Scout tried to make sense of it. She excused the missed dinners, the forgotten conversations. She told herself that grief worked differently for everyone. But even grief couldn't explain the coldness, the way Drew looked past her as though she were a stranger. Then came the anger, the tension in his voice, the sharpness of his movements, the way he would slam doors without warning. He wasn't violent. Not yet. But he wasn't safe either. Alone in that house, Scout began to uncover things. It started by accident, a folder left open on Drew's desk, a string of names and financial transfers she didn't understand. She became curious, cautious. She started reading his emails, memorizing names, making copies of files. What she found horrified her. These weren't the dealings of a grieving man, they were the movements of someone building a war. Drew was assembling a web of illegal activities, manipulation, bribery, threats. She couldn't understand it all, not yet. But she knew it was wrong. Still, she said nothing. He was her father. And despite everything, some small, fragile part of her still clung to hope that the man she once loved might return. But hope is a dangerous thing when paired with silence. The final blow came one evening, during an argument sparked by nothing. Scout had forgotten to lock the front door. Drew was furious. He yelled, louder than ever before. Scout tried to explain, her voice cracking, but he didn't listen. And then, without warning, he struck her. The slap wasn't brutal, not in the physical sense. But the betrayal in it shattered everything. It wasn't just the pain. It was the confirmation. The man before her wasn't her father. He was someone else. Someone capable of hurting her. Someone who didn't even flinch after raising his hand. Scout didn't wait. She packed a bag, ran through the front door, and didn't look back. She expected him to follow. He didn't. Instead, Drew picked up the phone and called Alexis Davis, his former mother-in-law. Scout left, he said, voice devoid of emotion. You might want to find her. Alexis was stunned. Her granddaughter, still a child in so many ways, had run from home, and Drew sounded as though he were reporting a missing item rather than a missing girl. Panic surged. Alexis began searching, calling every number she could think of, driving through the city, scanning parks and sidewalks, haunted by the fear of losing another child in the McCall line. She found Scout in a place only they knew, the little overlook above the city, where Sam used to take her when life felt overwhelming. Scout was curled up on the bench, eyes puffy from crying, her arms wrapped around her knees. Alexis approached quietly, not with questions, but with warmth. She sat beside her granddaughter, waited, and eventually, Scout spoke. She told Alexis everything. The neglect. The anger. The slap. And then she handed over the folder. Copies of documents, financial ledgers, message logs, all evidence of Drew's crimes. She had been gathering it slowly, unsure of what to do, but now, she knew. Drew Cain had gone too far. She could no longer protect him just because he shared her blood. Alexis, both horrified and heartbroken, embraced Scout and promised her protection. But more than that, she promised justice. She took the evidence and began assembling a case. Her legal mind, once dulled by fear and compromise, sharpened with purpose. She contacted a trusted ally in the legal system and filed the first complaint. Child abuse. Neglect. Then the financial crimes. Charges began to form like cracks in the foundation Drew had built around himself. News spread fast. The once respected veteran, businessman, and father would now face court not just for corporate fraud, but for abuse against his daughter. Drew tried to deny everything, tried to paint Scout as unstable, Alexis as manipulative. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Scout's testimony unshakable. At the preliminary hearing, Scout took the stand. Her voice never wavered. She recounted the night of the slap, the months of silence, the pain of being discarded. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply spoke the truth. Drew watched her from across the courtroom. Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps. But it was too late. The damage was done. Whatever remorse he felt now could never undo what he had become. The judge ruled that the charges would proceed to trial. Drew was placed under supervision. Alexis received temporary custody of Scout. And for the first time in what felt like years, the girl who had once wept silently in her bedroom finally felt seen, heard, and protected. But this was not the end of Scout Cain's story. It was the beginning. The beginning of a girl who refused to be defined by her father's sins. The beginning of a young woman who would rise from trauma not as a victim, but as a fighter. The name Cain would no longer represent betrayal. It would represent transformation. And somewhere, watching from beyond, Sam McCall would have been proud. Scout Cain moved into Alexis's home with a quiet determination. She brought only the essentials, her backpack, a few clothes, and the folder of evidence she had once clutched like a shield. In the weeks that followed the initial court hearing, she transformed from a shaken teenager into a young woman no longer afraid of the truth. Alexis gave her space but also structure. Mornings began with tea and news briefs, afternoons with school and quiet reading, evenings filled with discussions of court strategy and what Scout hoped would come next. Scout didn't talk much about her father anymore. When she did, her voice carried no bitterness, only resolve. Alexis knew the legal battle ahead would be brutal. Drew was a man with resources, connections, and a public reputation built on military valor and years of professional accomplishments. He wasn't going to disappear quietly. But she also knew his defenses were crumbling. His inner circle had shrunk. His allies were growing hesitant. And most importantly, his daughter was no longer under his roof, no longer under his control. That shift alone had already changed everything. Drew, meanwhile, had spiraled deeper into isolation. The initial hearing had bruised his ego, but what truly haunted him was Scout's face as she spoke in court. It was the look of someone who had finally stopped waiting to be loved. A look that said she had survived him. That look clung to his thoughts, even as he raged behind closed doors, making calls that went unanswered and issuing orders to legal teams who no longer followed them without question. The image of himself that he had so carefully constructed was slipping, and with it, the control he once held over everything. Still, Drew wasn't finished. He wasn't going to let Alexis take his daughter, and he wasn't going to let his child, destroy what remained of his reputation. He began working behind the scenes, contacting former associates who owed him favors. Not for defense, but for damage control. He wanted the public narrative rewritten. He wanted Alexis discredited, portrayed as the manipulative grandmother orchestrating this out of revenge. He wanted Scout's emotional testimony reinterpreted as the confusion of a girl corrupted by grief. He hired PR consultants, planted stories, and reached out to mutual contacts in media. But he underestimated Scout. He underestimated how deeply she had changed. As the court date approached, Scout insisted on preparing her own statement. Alexis offered to help, but Scout refused. She didn't want someone else's words. She wanted to speak for herself. She wrote it by hand at first, then typed it, revised it, and rehearsed it every evening in the quiet of Alexis's study. It wasn't angry. It was measured, raw, and piercingly honest. She spoke not only of the abuse, but of the silence that followed, the moments that built up over time, the slow erosion of love that had been more painful than any slap. She included the timeline of events she had tracked, the inconsistencies in her father's explanations, the evidence she had quietly gathered. It wasn't just the confession of a hurt daughter. It was a map of how a father lost his way. Alexis, reading the final draft, felt a wave of emotion she hadn't allowed herself in years. Pride. Heartbreak. Fierce protectiveness. Scout wasn't just trying to hold Drew accountable. She was making peace with the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. The day of the full trial arrived under gray skies. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lingered outside. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Alexis sat beside Scout, her presence both grounding and silent in its support. Drew entered last, his expression unreadable. He wore a crisp suit and the mask of a man still convinced he could win. But beneath the surface, there was a desperation he could no longer conceal. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, the timeline of neglect, the emotional abandonment, the act of physical aggression, and the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct. Drew's legal team countered with attempts to discredit Alexis and paint Scout as emotionally unstable following her mother's death. They presented character witnesses who spoke of Drew's past integrity, his service, his grief. But every testimony fell flat against the facts Scout had documented, the courage she brought to every answer she gave under cross-examination. Drew was called to the stand. The moment he began to speak, Scout looked directly at him. For the first time, he flinched. His answers were polished but hollow. His version of events avoided emotional detail. He didn't deny slapping Scout, but claimed it was a loss of control in a moment of fear. He described her as distant, secretive, and implied that Alexis had exploited that emotional distance. But when asked directly if he had ever read any of the letters Scout had written to him in the months before the trial, letters Alexis submitted into evidence, he hesitated. Then said no. It was the turning point. The jury saw the disconnect. A father who hadn't even read his daughter's final pleas before she fled. A man who had ignored, then struck, and then attempted to bury the damage with silence and power. The verdict was swift. Drew Cain was found guilty on multiple counts: child endangerment, neglect, and financial misconduct. Sentencing was scheduled, and while the penalties would be significant, it was clear that the true punishment had already taken place. Drew had lost Scout forever. After the trial, Scout didn't celebrate. She simply walked out of the courthouse with Alexis, head high, hands in her coat pockets, eyes dry. There were reporters, but she didn't speak to them. She had said everything she needed to say inside. In the weeks that followed, Drew was remanded into custody. Appeals were filed, but Alexis ensured the process remained airtight. She shielded Scout from further contact and helped arrange counseling sessions to help her work through the trauma. Slowly, Scout began to settle into something like normalcy. She returned to school, kept a few close friends, spent quiet evenings writing and reading. She still visited Sam's grave once a week. Sometimes Alexis went with her, sometimes she went alone. Those visits were not about grief anymore. They were about remembering who she came from. Scout never again saw her father in person. But months later, she received a letter. It was short, apologetic in tone but devoid of specifics. A final gesture from a man who had finally run out of excuses. Scout read it once. Then she placed it in a drawer and never opened it again. Because she understood now that not all apologies deserve forgiveness. And not all scars need to be erased. Some become the reason we grow stronger.